Hey everyone, my name is Bryan Wain. I've been at Grubhub for about 3 years now, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about migrating apps to React and Redux. So you know, the examples are all going to be Angular, but if you're familiar with similar things like Backbone or Ember, the concept should translate well. But yeah, stop me if you have any questions about it. So why do we want to do this? Why do we want to migrate? Well, a lot of us want to use new technologies at work, but usually we're limited by all the legacy code we have. Like, it's not easy to integrate necessarily, and rewrites are costly. They're hard to sell to management. So you want to find a way to you want to integrate your new code with the old code well, but you don't want to cause a big mess. So our goal is to completely replace Angular in our project with React and Redux. We don't want to stop releasing new features to production because that just usually means it's going to be harder to sell to management. We don't want to create another parallel project and play catch up. We want to have the code stay understandable and clean during the transition because depending on the size of your project, it can take a long time. We've been working on ours for a while, and if you don't plan it well, it can turn into a big mess, and it's just hard to manage. But if you can do all this, then you basically turn the migration into tech debt. And tech debt is a lot easier to justify because it's not going to be like a big blocker for any kind of new features. You can get to it as needed and break it up into smaller pieces. And that makes it a lot easier to justify and sell and just manage overall. So I'm going to go over a bit how the process works at a high level. And then I have a little demo app, and I'm going to go through migrating some pieces of it from Angular to React and Redux, and that'll be it. So before you start in this kind of thing, a couple things to keep in mind is it's helpful to make sure that your UI before you start is following good component design architecture. So like proper separation of concerns between parents and children. It makes it a lot easier to migrate because those smaller components are a lot easier to work with than larger monolithic things. And also the smaller components just translate well to React components because that's just how they're designed. It's also helpful to have a good end-to-end test suite. They can help you verify that your migration didn't break anything because your end-to-end tests are basically a constant. They're not going to change depending on if you're Angular or React or whatever, so if they're still working and you didn't change any features, then that's a good sign that you didn't break anything. Can everyone back there hear me by the way? Okay, cool. So yeah, end-to-end tests are a good thing to have to help verify. It's also helpful just to verify that the technologies you're going to use, the big ones, you don't want to change those in the middle. So something like immutable, or which side effect library you're using with Redux, or TypeScript or not, that kind of thing. It's good to know that beforehand because you don't want to write a bunch of new code and then find you want to rewrite it. Oh, I should have used immutable, or oh, I should have used TypeScript. So the earlier you decide those things, the better. Also, one thing we found helpful was creating a new folder for the code because a lot of times when you're taking on this kind of project, you're going to have your legacy code, which probably has lower standards for what you want out of it. Your newer code, you'll probably want different linting rules, higher code coverage, maybe a new folder structure. It's a lot easier to enforce that if you keep your new code separate from your old code and kind of just have your pristine folder that you're not worried about getting into a bad state. You get your new code, you make sure it's all up to your standards, and then don't worry about the old one as much. So the plan at a high level, all these are pretty simple on their own. It's more just how they should work together that makes it a little more complicated. But migrating visual components for a single page to React. So we're going to go page by page, doing the visual components. And then as we do the visual components more, we're then going to get to the point where we want to migrate some of the state logic to Redux. So we're going to do the visual components and then the state logic for a page. And then as we need it, there's going to be some global kind of state, like authentication and that kind of thing. So as we need to, we'll migrate that to Redux, when we need to. But we're going to repeat this for every page. And then at that point, you'll have a bunch of React pages, basically, with an Angular container on top. So at that point, you just kind of convert the last Angular components on top. And at that point, you can delete Angular and then profit. So step one, usually a good place to start, is just migrating your visual components. So the tool we used was ng React. There's similar ones out there for Angular. and I think there's similar, I've seen similar ones for Backbone and Ember and those kind of things. But basically, it creates like an Angular wrapper for a React component, so you can use the React component from Angular. So it would take, it's like an Angular service, which takes a React component and returns an Angular component, which you can then use. So it handles all of the like passing props back and forth to the React component, calling the lifecycle hooks and everything. It'll handle all that for you. The general pattern we followed was you start at the bottom of the component tree and work your way up. That helps a lot because the bottom leaf components basically are usually isolated and simple, and those are the easiest ones to migrate because you're basically just copying and pasting. Converting the dump component, you're just basically copying and pasting the HTML. It's now JSX. Maybe you replace class with class name, and that's usually it. Like you'll move around some logic, but those are the simplest pieces. So it's a good place to start. It helps you get used to the migration flow, and it's just also easier to like start from the bottom and work your way up because then if you're like proper like React's one-way data flow, like your React components are not concerned with their parents; they're only concerned with their children. So it starts with React and then works its way. It's like React all the way down from the top, so you don't have to worry about Angular as much from the React code. So if you do this also, then the business logic, which is usually not at the very bottom of the component tree, will stay in Angular at first, then you can migrate it later when you get to it. So just a basic example of that, before and after. Here's an Angular component. Pretty simple. The template displays the hello string, which is defined in the controller. And then at the bottom you can see how it use it from an Angular component. So it's just a hello world thing. So what that would look like after converting it, the top thing is a pretty standard React component. Takes the hello, or takes the message prop and passes it, and renders it with the hello string. And then the key thing here, is this wrapper around React, or around the component, which is the hello world. It makes the hello world directive basically in Angular. So that's what makes the Angular directive that you can use over there. It matches the attribute in the HTML with the React prop. And all it is it's an Angular directive. It uses this React directive service, which is provided by ng React, and wraps your component. And there you go. You got a Angular component you can use that wraps a React component. So some of the tips we learned that caused us headaches, and so one of the first things is if your data has a new format, it's best to make sure you're using it from the start in all of your new components. So the key thing here might be like immutable JS. You don't want to like pass non-immutable objects to your React components if you know you're going to later convert them to immutable. That's just going to be rewriting brand new code. So it's helpful if you know you're going to do that. So it's like you don't have to convert all of your Angular code to use immutable up front, but you could like at the boundary where you're creating a React component from an Angular component, convert it before you pass it to the component, convert the data to immutable, and then pass it in so that the React component is using what it's going to be using the whole time. Another helpful thing that worked for us was making a wrapper for ng React and using that instead. So it'll still do the same logic underneath, but the thing where this came up mostly is if you're familiar with the provider from React Redux, what it does is it exposes the Redux store to an entire tree of components in React. And you want that at the top of every component tree you have. And usually a React app, you just have one component tree. But if you're doing this, then every time you create a component with ng React, you have a new component tree. And so you want to make sure the top of that component tree has this provider if you want to use connected components in there. So it's helpful if you make a wrapper that provides the provider tag every time you use it, ng React, then you'll just always be able to use connected components as if you were in a normal application and not have to worry about whether or not where you are in the component structure. So that's the general idea behind migrating visual components. The next helpful thing that worked for us was building, we call it an Angular bridge. So, helpful example, I guess. One of the first things we did, we had this table, and it was a pretty straightforward table. The first thing we did was migrate it to be a React table instead of an Angular table. But what happened when you clicked on one of the rows was it opened a modal, and we didn't want to like start off rewriting the whole modal service and having that work also in React. So it was helpful to be able to call Angular code from outside of Angular. So basically from like React and maybe Redux side effects or something. So yeah, we made this is a really simple thing. Like Angular lets you access services from outside if you do this kind of thing where you access the root element of the Angular app. But basically, you do something like that, and you can access your Angular services from outside. So you see, if you use that, you can call some service, call the method getData on there, pass it in some parameters, and now you can use that data as if you were calling an Angular service or from a regular Angular code, but you're actually outside of it. So it kind of helps loosen the way you the requirements for doing any given migration, because you're no longer worried about doing everything that that component depends on. You're only worried about doing what you need to, and you can use this kind of, it's like an escape hatch, so I wouldn't like just do everything with this. You still want to convert things at the right time, but sometimes it's not worth converting everything you need to do something right away when you can use this instead. So it kind of just helps to be a little more flexible in the order you convert things. Another significant part of this was dealing with the routers. So as you work your way up the component tree, at some point you're going to have converted a whole page. And so at this point, it's helpful to have like a React router running in parallel with the Angular router. So you can have the Angular router be like the source of truth. So it's responsible for handling all of the location changes, which it always was, so that doesn't require any changes. But the new responsibility it has now is also notifying the React router of any location changes. So typically, like the way the same way you'd update the location when you click on a link in any normal React app with a React router, you call like browser history.push or whatever it is. It's the same thing. You just have Angular do that, like when it detects the location change. So this way, you have your Angular router, which is like managing the actual location, and then it's notifying the React router of any updates. So you've got both routers, and you can have like the React router rendering your React pages, and the Angular router rendering your Angular pages, and you've got like a fully React page that's not rendering with any Angular. So the Angular router is going to need to know about all of the routes because it's responsible for it has to know if since you only want to render content from one router at any given time. The Angular router needs to know, like, oh, am I on a React page? If so, render nothing. And the React router can just kind of render nothing if it doesn't recognize the page either way. But like usually, if you don't recognize your page, you'll probably want to like show some kind of 404 page or something. So you usually would say like have Angular have like, or the Angular router have like a catch-all saying like, if I don't recognize the router or the route, show my 404 page. But you'll want to recognize the React pages and just render nothing for them. And that'll help. That'll help you like. So you'll have your React router running in parallel with your Angular router, and you can keep your routes separate and kind of build your React router up until you have all your routes in React. So the last major step is migrating the business and state logic, and really the logic for all the if you're doing everything else that we were doing before, then the Redux code is pretty straightforward, typical Redux. Like there's nothing that special about it as far as Angular goes. Like your side effects may use that Angular bridge to call some Angular services, but other than that, like it's really just going to be straightforward Redux talking with your React components, and you don't have to worry about doing anything too weird in it. Though the one thing to keep in mind is since the logic you're moving is usually in Angular services, which are often depended on by a lot of areas, not just one because they're singletons. It's often hard, like if you want to go, like your first impulse when you convert a service to put all the stuff in Redux might be, okay, now I can delete this service. But every other service that uses that, every other component that uses that service will now need to go and change because you just deleted it. And it's often a lot easier. It's kind of the same way with like the Angular bridge loosens the order you need to do things. If you once you're moving the logic out, you can keep the service around as like a proxy for Redux. So basically just call the Redux store, like get values from it, or call dispatch from the Redux store from the service. So get value used to say just give me this dot value, and now it's just returning get state dot value. And that'll just let you, like, let's say I have service foo and service bar, or like component 1 and component 2, and I converted component 1, but they both use a shared service. I don't have to worry about changing component 2, even though I changed how the service works under the hood. It's still just talking to Redux now to do all of its logic, but as far as the other component knows, nothing changed. So it just kind of helps with making sure you don't have to do everything all at once and do like one giant change, but yeah, it helps you just keep the kind of the migration like pretty clean. So the last steps at this point is pretty straightforward. You got a bunch of pages all in React, and your Angular router is just doing nothing anymore, so you can delete it. All your state's mostly in Redux, so at this point, the only Angular stuff remaining is this top-level components and maybe a few services. So at that point, you just want to convert the last few pieces basically the same way you did before, and then you can delete Angular, and you're basically done. And yeah, so now I'll kind of go into a little more detail about what each of those steps look like. Second. So we got this little sample app. It's all Angular. There's no React or Redux or anything. It's pretty. Let me make this a little bigger, actually. So it's got a counter. You can increment it or decrement it. And if you go to the other page, there's a bunch of pizzas. Oh, it's too big. So the pizzas are stored in like a global service, or not the pizzas, the count of pizzas. So I'll go through the code real quick, but it's pretty straightforward Angular. Got my app. It's got a couple routes. Is this big enough? Got my app, a couple routes, bootstrapping a regular Angular app. Let's see, the Angular service is pretty simple. Just got a broadcast method, get count, increment, decrement. Page 1, it's got so an update. It basically talks to the Angular service and then exposes everything to its counter child component, which has just a couple buttons and a count. Page 2 is pretty similar. Talks to the service and then displays a bunch of pizzas. So the first task that I want to work on is migrating this pizza component to use React. So there won't be any Redux involved. It's just going to be a simple transition from Angular to React. So just going to make pizza.js. So pretty simple React component. I'm going to start by importing React. Let's see. So I'm going to make a pizza component. It's going to have a count prop. I'm going to get to that in a second. So it's got prop types. So with ng React, it uses your prop types to figure out which attributes it should watch and pass down. So like using prop types is important when you're doing stuff with ng React. So we've got this pizza component, and then it's a pretty simple component. We're not going to need any of that. I'm just going to copy this. So looks pretty similar to the other one, but we'll need to do the logic in the JavaScript instead of with ng repeat. Pizzas, so we're going to make pizzas equal to array. Just push a bunch of stuff on pizzas. So we won't need this anymore. And then this tilde thing is because it was HTML before. React component should be done now, but it's not going to do anything yet because it's not hooked up to use. It's still, the parent component is still using the Angular one. So now we're going to make the ng React wrapper. So we're going to use Angular, ng React. Got one dependency, which this is the ng React module. And then you just, so it's called pizza. And so, yeah, that should all, oh, and you got to export the module. So, there's the ng React wrapper. We just need to use this now. So that should do it. And now, let's go back and clean our account. And we've got 3 pieces. So, yeah, now with that, we can also delete all the Angular code that we just replaced. It's not being used anymore. So module, HTML, and all the other ones are gone. And now there's just pizza.js. And you can see that it's rendered as a React component. So that was step 1. I'm going to advance a bit now. Okay, so now after this, I've got step 2. It's so I moved a bunch of stuff out of the Angular folder. I made a Redux store, pretty straightforward Redux store. So notice we're exporting this, and it's because we're going to need it in the Angular service. And I know that's typically not what you want to do because of server-side rendering, but I think in general, if you have an Angular app, you're probably not server-side rendering in most cases, so I don't think it's too bad while you're still transitioning. Yeah, so made a router, did rendering page 2. We've got our reducer, pretty straightforward reducer, manages just a count, increment +1, state, or decrement -1, a couple actions. I made the top component a connected component. So this is all pretty standard, React and Redux, nothing really special about it. This hasn't changed. I just got rid of the wrapper though. So yeah, this is all, and this all stayed the same. I got rid of the page 2, which would probably cause an issue. Restart. Increment and decrement, but that's not going to help us. We're trying to switch locations and we're still on page 1. And so the problem, there's a couple problems here. The first one is that I didn't keep all my routes in the Angular router. And so normally you want something like here where you have like a otherwise or default route. And by only viewing it in the React router here, Angular is just redirecting me because it doesn't recognize page 2, even though it's actually a valid route. So we want to add that back in, but we don't need a template anymore because we're just going to render nothing. And then if you notice, so Angular renders its router where you put this ng view thing. So all the routed components go here, and the React app is going to render here because that's where it's pointing to. And so they're going to render their pages right next to each other. And one of these will always be empty. So as far as when you see this, you can't really tell just by looking at it which one's rendering it. And that's what you want, because you want to be able to just seamlessly switch from React rendering or Angular rendering a page to React. So now that I switched that router, let's see what happens. Bump the thing, and it works. I can now switch to page 2, but I have no pieces. The problem is that I never did the Angular service yet. That's still managing its own data, and it's not using Redux, but the other thing is using Redux. So we want to use the Redux store and turn this service into a proxy for Redux. So we're going to import the store. We don't need that anymore. We are still going to want to broadcast on updates. We're not going to use our own count. Instead, we're going to call. So normally we go into the state, but our state is just a single number. So you just call get state directly, and that should be fine. Don't need to worry about that. But we do. We need to import those actions. So or those action creators, I guess I should say. So import increment and decrement. So store.dispatch. So we're going to dispatch actions here, and this one's going to be an increment. And this one's going to be a decrement. And that, yeah, so we're still going to want to broadcast in case anything's listening in Angular. So that should solve our issues. Refresh. Bump the thing, and oh, something's still wrong here. So we dispatched actions. Yes, we did. So we're just not displaying anything here. Very wrong. That's empty. The state is not empty. Sorry, not sure what I did here.
Misspelled pizza.
I misspelled pizza?
Pizza.js.
Where?
And I think pizza.js.
Here?
Oh,
Sorry?
never mind.
Oh. A second. There. All right, I'm just going to cheat and look at the source. Something different here. No, that didn't work. I'm not sure what I did. It's not routing correctly. Oh, I just remembered. So I forgot to update the React router state from the Angular router. So what we need to do is every time the Angular location changes, we need to change the React router so that it knows to render the new route. So we're gonna run. So yeah, so we're going to listen, and then Angular has this thing you can listen to location changes. Then on success, we are going to bump the browser location change to the React router. So this is just typical. This browser history.push thing is typical React router, how you update the location. So that should solve the issue, unless I have a typo. So bump the thing, and we've got pieces. So yeah, now we've got an Angular page, a React page, all the states in Redux, and that's it for, that might be it for everything actually. I forgot if this is step 3. Has anything in it. So at this point, yeah, I think that's all of, like, I could do the page 1, but it's basically the same as page 2, like converting this component is the same. So I don't really know if it's worth doing. It's basically the exact same thing as the other one. So I think that's it. Yeah, that's the end of the demo. And then, yeah, if you have any questions, well, yeah, that's it. You have any questions? Yeah.
What kind of performance differences or benefits or costs did you see as you're going through the process?
So early on, there wasn't much of a difference because, even just doing a leaf component is not going to make a huge difference. But if you've got any pages that are slow, and we have a bunch, especially because a lot of our code runs on some old tablets or slow tablets, then we saw a huge performance difference when we stopped rendering all that data with Angular. Because the digest cycle, if you're watching these large arrays of objects, it's going to be really slow. And if you're doing everything with immutable, and you use like should component update properly to avoid extra renders, we saw huge speed bumps just from switching that. Yeah.
I'm not sure how literal your examples were in the service bridge, but was that synchronous?
Sorry, the Angular bridge thing?
Service in the render?
The Angular bridge you said, or something?
Yeah, the service bridge.
You're making sure you're talking about this or something else?
Yeah, that looks like it's in the render.
Yeah, this bot, like in component.js, that would run in render. So the call to call Angular service is synchronous. I mean, you can call an asynchronous method from there. In that case, you would just handle the promise or do whatever you want with it. But yeah, it is synchronous. So it can be used basically as if you're in an Angular
So that would
controller.
block the render cycle on waiting for that.
Sorry?
That would block the render cycle on waiting for some
Yes.
API call or something?
Yeah, it would block it. So I wouldn't call anything crazy slow in there. But yeah, it'll be synchronous. I think it's yeah.
Have you, so it seems like you're, I don't want to say using React Router a lot in your bridge in this thing, and there's a rewrite in the new version.
Yeah, so we haven't upgraded to that yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would matter.
I don't think
I guess if you haven't upgraded it to it doesn't matter, but I didn't know if you had suggestions on like, do you have to build the bridge with like, no, it doesn't really matter.
I don't think the interaction between Angular and React, the which version of the router you're using matters too much. We're basically using the React router like any normal React router. The only weird thing is the Angular router is the one that's calling the browser history.push. But however, we have to change the location in future versions. We should be able to switch pretty easily. I think there was one right behind you.
You might have answered this. When did you guys start doing this project?
We started looking at it like a year ago. I think the first thing that got immersed in after was last summer, and then we've kind of been working on it sporadically since then, I guess. We are about to finish up our like biggest page, migrating all the components. So yeah, we've been going at it a while, though it hasn't been like we've been dedicating all our time to it. It's kind of every once in a while we were working on it, and then occasionally we like dedicate a little more time.
Did you have a big increase in your payload size from having both frameworks?
There was a payload size, an increase. There's not really any way around that if you want to run both.
Right.
We figured it was worth it, especially like our app like tends to be open for a while, so I'd rather be a little faster, even at the cost of a little slower startup. But definitely something to consider. Hey.
Was all new work done in React, or was there like both new work in both React and Angular?
Yeah, we're still doing both. We didn't want to like set a hard rule like no new stuff in Angular, just because that would just make it difficult. Like if you've got like a whole page still in Angular and you want to change like a little thing, we don't want to force you to do it in React if it's going to be difficult. So I mean, you could be as strict as you want about it. We figured it was worth it to just not try and slow ourselves down. Like our emphasis is still on getting features out, so we don't want to slow down too much. Yeah.
My organization, we've heard the argument like, hey, there's no, the devs don't know React yet, so how did you confront that issue with proposing Migrating?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the. He was laughing because he was my boss at the time. But, like nobody knows React. So we just did training sessions. Like we have like Learning Friday. Every Friday afternoon we just learn whatever you want. And so a lot of people just spent Learning Fridays learning it. We did had meetings like every once in a while and like went through sessions of like similar to what we just did, like migrating something or just doing an app, a small app in React and Redux from the start. So it's just kind of like training sessions and yeah.
That was Angular 1, right?
Yeah, that's Angular 1.
So how did you decide React versus Angular 2?
We are still not sure that Angular 2 is ever going to be like that great, I guess. So we just kind of went with React.
You mean Angular 4?
Oh yeah, I haven't looked at Angular 4 yet, but no. We at the time we didn't like what direction Angular 2 was going in, and so React was like, if we were going to start something new, React was like the obvious choice for us, and yeah. Yeah.
So, do you do server-side rendering at all?
Sorry?
Do you do server-side rendering at all, or it's optimization?
We don't do any server-side rendering yet. I'm not sure if we ever will. Just might not make sense for us. It is. So, like I was pointing out, it's kind of hard with the way we did that thing where we're importing the store. Because that's kind of with server-side rendering, you want to create a store on every request, and that's hard if you're importing the store from a global location. So we aren't doing that, and the pattern I had would make it difficult. You could get around that and not import the store like that. It just wouldn't, for us, it wasn't worth it to try and do that. Yeah.
When it comes to testing, were you able to move the tests pretty easily, or was there some?
So the end-to-end test didn't need to change too much. There was, if you're familiar with HTTP backend and Protractor, all our old end-to-end tests were Protractor. Those we had to come up with something new to do that kind of mocking because that's not available. We didn't want to use HTTP or $HTTP from React stuff, so we have a wrapper around fetch, and we use that for some of the mocking. But other than that, our end-to-end test didn't change too much. The unit tests, those were, I mean, we just as we deleted old components, we just deleted the unit tests and wrote the new ones for the new React components. Like the tests were pretty different just because with our Angular components, we didn't really test the templates that much. That was one of the nice things about React is that we were able to test the templates instead of like what the controller is doing, which doesn't mean you're using it correctly. So we used Enzyme to test our React components, and that was pretty easy for the unit tests. And yeah, I think like the testing was like one of the easiest parts to make sure we got right, because the unit tests, like all the new code, you just test that file and it's still pretty isolated. And so the reducers and the components, they're all pretty easy to test. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
You said choose what side effect library to use.
Yeah.
What did you guys end up choosing?
So we used Redux Loop, but we ended up forking it, and now we're just using the fork, and they've gone in kind of a different direction. So we're still trying to decide what we're doing with that. But I like Redux Loop and how they approached it. It was, if you're familiar with Elm, it's based on like the Elm architecture, and it seems to be a pretty good way. Like I like how it keeps your side effect logic, or the logic for choosing what your side effects are, not necessarily running them, but in the same reducer, in the same as that. But like Saga, I've looked at, it also seems like a good approach. Thunk is good if you're starting out. It seems like it might be tough to scale, but it's definitely the simplest thing to get started with. But yeah, we use Loop. Yeah.
Yeah, do you know what's the percentage of the code that has been moved to React and how much work is left?
I don't know off the top of my head. You have any idea?
I'd say probably like 35, 40%.
I think it's more than that. Like, so we have like a lot of like a couple simple pages, and those like should be pretty easy to move. We just finished or finishing up our most complicated page. So yeah, something like close to half, plus or minus 15-20%. Hard to say really. It's a long process, but it's showing dividends.
Talk about memory benefits?
Yeah, someone asked already. It's faster rendering. Anyone else? Cool. Well, thanks.